Welcome to the Compliance 911 Show, a no-nonsense podcast discussing hot topics for today's busy compliance professional. It's everything you wanted to know about regulatory compliance, but we're afraid to ask. And now, here are your hosts, Dean Stockford of M&amp Consulting and Len Suzio of GeoDataVision.
Hey, Len, here we are again today. So what interesting topic do you have for our audience?
Well, Dean, I've had so much redlining experience the last 2 years. I thought I would address one aspect that I've become aware of because of our consulting engagements regarding threatened referrals to the DOJ for redlining accusations by the federal bank regulators. There's no doubt it's a very hot topic, and more banks are becoming ensnarled in the anti-redlining web that's been spun by the Department of Justice in cooperation with the prudential bank regulators. So it's going to be a redlining issue and some specifics related to it.
Well, you certainly know how to identify hot topics and when you see one, Len, and certainly don't back away from them. But with the DOJ bragging about a record number of redlining referrals from the prudential bank regulators and record-breaking number of settlements, I'm certain our audience wants to hear what you have to say about what's going on regarding this whole redlining initiative.
Well, through my experience these past 2 years in particular, I've observed regulators engage in what I would characterize as abusive regulator practice related to the three different areas. One, the misuse of statistical analysis. Two, the adoption of long-standing approaches to the reasonably expected market area, REMAs, changing those practices that have been in effect since 2009. And three, the misuse of Census 2020 demographics. Today, I'm going to discuss this latter issue, the misuse of the Census 2020 demographics.
Well, I'm all well aware of the controversy, I should say, over the concept of REMA and how the agencies are applying it differently and that they have historically done. And I've heard, some things about statistical significance, but I've not heard anything said about the implementation and application of the new Census 2020 demographics and redlining. I'm all ears, Len. So what do you have to say about this?
Well, Dean, until I had this experience, I wasn't aware of the problems created by the implementation of the new Census 2020 demographics, especially as they relate to tract minority status until recently. But the more I became aware of how the Census 2020 demographics affect community, racial, and ethnic profiles, and specifically how they affect the census tract minority status, the more I began to understand the implications for potential redlining. And they are big.
Sounds interesting. Let's hear it.
Well, there are several ways in which the new tracts have created problems that the regulators seem to either not know about or deliberately ignore. The implementation of the Census 2020 demographics to the geographic dispersion of HMDA data has the following implications. First, the number of census tracts for the entire country increased from a little more than 75,000 tracts during 2021 to a bit more than 85,000 tracts beginning in 2022. So there were about 10,000 new tracts added to the FFIEC demographic files. Now, the impact of the 10,000 new tracts affected far more than the 10,000 tracts themselves. Why? Well, because they were all created from old tracts. So at least 20,000 of the initial 75,000 tracts were affected, with many old tracts expiring and many new tracts being corrected. But not only that, there are the thousands of old tracts changed their minority classification. And I'm speaking here of the majority minority tracts, such as the majority Black census tracts, the majority Hispanic census tracts, and the majority Black and Hispanic census tracts. We here at GeoDataVision have estimated that 40% or more of the pre-2022 tracts were affected by these factors. And another aspect, the FFIEC did not announce the identity nor the minority status of the tracts until the end of the first quarter of 2022, well into the year in which they applied. So banks were operating in the dark for many of the applications they reported on their 2022 Hamdalar. And a fourth aspect or consideration is that many of the mortgage applications, as we all know, can take months to process. In one case, we reviewed the 2022 Hamdalar of a lender and determined, believe it or not, that 36% of their 2022 Hamdalar applications were initiated during 2021 and into the first quarter of 2022 before the FFIC announced the new tracts and their minority status. This means that a loan application geocoded to a census tract at the time of application could have an entirely new tract with a different minority status by the time of the final action, which of course is when the official geocoding is applied for reporting purposes. So for a bank making good faith efforts to improve their volume of lending in their assessment area or their REMA, the reasonably expected market area, within those tracts in those areas, this means they were seriously handicapped in their efforts to achieve better results in their community's majority minority tracts.
So hopefully you can answer this, but how do the examiners handle these complications? Or do they?
Well, my experience these last 2 years is the examiners don't seem to get into these complications. You would think that they would be aware of these problems and how they apply to potential redlining situations. But I've yet to see a situation where an examiner has indicated they've even thought about these new tracts and how they make for a complicated, if not confusing, situation for banks.
Yeah, well, it certainly seems like a setup, and it's just unreal. So how do you, or do you, I should say, have recommendations for people that are listening on how to navigate this?
Absolutely. This is really important. So I hope people listen closely to what I'm about to say. And the good thing is this is a recording, so people can go back and re-listen, because I have a number of suggestions, 9 of them in particular. So first of all, of course, a bank shouldn't wait for an examiner to investigate and understand how the new tracts may have affected the distribution of their loans among the majority minority tracts, and in particular in the majority Black tracts, the majority Hispanic tracts, and the majority Black and Hispanic tracts. So bankers should check out 1, how many new tracts were created in their REMA? 2, how many old tracts were terminated in their REMA? 3, how many continuing tracts had their minority status changed? And 4th, which tracts became minority tracts that were not minority tracts before? Firstly, number 5, which tracts that were majority minority tracts became non-minority tracts? Number 6, what is the distribution of the majority minority tract subtypes in the REMA? By subtypes, I'm talking about majority Black census tracts, majority Hispanic census tracts, and majority Black plus Hispanic census tracts. And by the way, as an aside, that seems to be one of the major new approaches that the regulators are employing too. It used to be that they will look just at the majority minority tracts with all minorities aggregated into those tracts, but now they actually are breaking them out into majority Black tracts, majority Hispanic tracts, and majority Black plus Hispanic tracts. Again, there's been no fanfare announcing this. It's just something that's happening in the field, and our listeners should definitely be aware of that. It's no longer enough to just look at your lending in the majority minority tracts. You should then go and break out according to these different subtypes. And then another suggestion I have is bankers should look at their applications in their 2022 Hamdalar and see how many of them were received during 2021 and the first quarter of 2022, when no one knew what these new tracts are, and what their minority status is. Then another suggestion, number 8, which is which of those 2022 Hamdalar applications had their tract minority status change from 2021 to 2022. We were looking at a particular client recently that's being evaluated by the FDIC, and this issue of redlining has been raised. And when we looked at their Hamdalar for 2022, we discovered that about 36% of their applications had been received during this period of time when no one knew what the new tracts were going to be. And moreover, we found that 20+% of them had their tracts identity changed from 2021 to 2022. So when the bank received the application, if they were looking at the minority status of the tract that the application was in, they might see one thing, but by the time the deal is closed or by the time the final action is taken, it could be a totally different tract with a totally different minority status. So it's important for bankers to look at that when they review their Hamdalar. Now, these different results may help a lender explain why they have had a statistically significant results in 2022, and it may help mitigate the criticism by examiners in such situations. But don't leave it up to the examiners to do this. Carpe diem, seize the initiative, do this in advance, see how these various issues that I've raised today affect your performance before the examiners show up, and then you'll be prepared if and when you're showing statistically significant results to help explain why you shouldn't be referred to the DOJ.
Well, this has been very interesting. And one of my favorite words, Len, of course, quote, provocative conversation. So thanks for enlightening our audience today. This is Dean Stockford with M&amp Consulting.
And this is Len Suzio of GeoDataVision saying, thank you for listening in today. Please let us know of any subjects you would like us to address in future podcasts.
Thanks for listening to the Compliance 911 Show. If you like the podcast, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. While you're at it, please give us a like and review to help others find the show. As always, links are in the show notes, and you can always find us online at compliance911show.com. Follow M&amp Consulting and GeoDataVision on LinkedIn for all the latest news and information on compliance hot topics.